So welcome everybody to this research seminar. I'm very happy to welcome Johanna Rickne. It's about time, I think it's correct to say. Johanna is a professor of economics at the Swedish Institute for Social Research and also at Nottingham University and the Stockholm School of Economics. And you got your PhD from Uppsala in 2011. Like me, you're an Uppsala alumni. On essays in development, institution and gender, and your research interests, which you're very well known for, is in labor economics, gender economics and political economics. And that's what your talk is going to be about too, the class ceiling in politics, not talked so much about, so we will learn a lot. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. So I have 45 minutes or an hour?
Yeah, we're not so rigid, so if you're going to...
and questions come throughout, right?
As you like. You
Yes, please ask questions throughout.
Yeah, we take questions of clarification just during the talk and then longer questions later on.
Okay.
And I'm the judge of that.
Okay, so you can show me like 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Thank you. So nice to see you all, and thanks for the invitation. I'm presenting this paper, which is actually pretty late stage work. The paper is hopefully soon going to appear in a journal close to you. So Olle Folke and I in this paper are working on politicians' careers, and we are especially interested in comparing working class politicians to other politicians. And the working class politician is going to be defined in this project based on people's own occupation. Someone like Stefan Löfven, who was a welder working in industry, he is going to be defined as a worker, while someone like a lawyer or a business person is going to be defined as a non-worker. We had a previous project where we instead looked at parental class background, which would redefine DeSantis into like a worker because his parents were arguably workers. And we showed in that project that political representation in Sweden is very good when it comes to parental background in social class. And in this project, I'm going to tell you in the next 45 minutes that numerical political representation is very bad in Sweden when it comes to people's own occupation. Working class people rarely enter parliament around the world. They are about 50% of the population, but just 5 to 15% of parliaments. And this creates democratic deficits, for example, in skewing the content of political decisions away from working class people's priorities, so-called substantive political representation, and also creating the perception of low legitimacy of the political system, perhaps anti-elitism and counter-politician movements, which is would be a deficit in so-called symbolic representation. In a recent literature review of the literature on working class people in politics, Carnes and Lupu kind of summarized the literature as saying that we know by now that workers are absent in parliament at the highest level, and we know that this absence of workers causes these democratic deficits. But the pressing next issue in the literature is to try to figure out where in the career pipeline that leads to parliament that workers disappear and why workers like leak out of the career pipeline. So those two questions are precisely the ones that we try to pick up in this paper. Where in the career pipeline to parliaments do workers disappear and why? I'm gonna describe to you using Swedish data the share of working class people on different career steps, and then test explanations for workers' slower progress up the career ladder. Summarizing those kind of explanations that we test, we look at voter preferences, workers' own potential lack of some individual resource for promotion, like ambition, competence, or time, promotion discrimination by the party, or organizational ties to labor unions. So after summarizing just some contextual factors about the Swedish case, our data and definitions, I'm going to talk about like a non-mathematical theoretical discussion of reasons that workers might advance more slowly. And then I'm going to present these two sets of empirical results and conclude. Sweden is an interesting case study for this question because we are discussed in the literature as a most likely case for workers' political inclusion. So any arguably like problems in workers' representation that we find in Sweden is likely going to be larger in other contexts. Sweden has a multi-party system. We have flexible list-based proportional representation. We have publicly funded elections, and all these things are expected to help workers advance and enter politics. We have a high degree of unionization in the labor market, and our party system contains a large social democratic party with historical roots to the labor union movement. Not all countries have that, and that is really believed to help workers into politics. Finally, Swedish political parties have internal cultures that put less emphasis on elite education as kind of a promotion capital compared to other countries. We don't have an Oxbridge system, as in the UK, where nearly all politicians come from Oxford and Cambridge. Here in Sweden, you can come from a little bit of all universities. Like there's no like kind of institution like that. So Olle Folke and I have now been digitizing electoral ballots for Swedish politicians for 10 years. And now that data stretches back to the early 70s. So we have 50 years of data. And this data we have deposited at Statistics Sweden. So anyone can order this data and work with it. So over 70 years, we have the universe of nominated and elected politicians on all levels. We know, of course, party, the list rank on the ballot, if they were elected, and the number of preference votes. Since 2002, Sweden has preference votes. We link this via the politician's personal identification number, which parties have to list on the ballot. Right? Parties have to submit their ballot to the government with the personal identification number of every person on the list. So when we digitize these, we have a complete record of politicians' identification numbers, and you can link that to more or less any other admin data. So we have linked it. In this project, we use standard tax record information, occupation information, of course. We also use high school grades and the Swedish Armed Force qualification tests. And in addition to this admin data, we use surveys among voters and among politicians. And we participated specifically in the Kolfu surveys, which go to all municipal politicians with a 2/3 response rate. We entered questions on so-called soft competence for politics, your ambition, your public service motivation, your honesty, and how hard you work. Right. We define the working class, as I said, by the person's own employment from the administrative records, and we use the paradigmatic approach to studying social class in sociology, which is, I'm proud to say, as a person working at SOFI, Stockholm University, the Ericsson Goldthorpe Portocanero theme. Robert Ericsson was like famous sociology from SOFI.
Has been here.
Oh, I'm sure. So this is an important, this is kind of a nice way of defining workers. And we can verify the definition because we have citizen surveys with a large amount of people. We have the same variable for working class from the EGP. And we also have a question in these surveys asking, like, which social class are you? So people self-define, meaning that we can verify that the people we define as social class by the EGP scheme also coincides greatly with people's own self-definition. We want to classify every person. Sorry, I have from my child from kindergarten cold. We want to classify every person in the voting age population 18 plus as a worker or non-worker. So we count students as non-workers. For people who are on sick leave in a specific year, we go backward in time and kind of find, their most recent occupation. For people who are retired, we do the same thing. If you're already retired in an election year, we want to see the share of workers in the population. For the retired people, we go back in time and find their most recent occupation. We do the same thing for anyone who's a full-time politician. These are Swedish mayors and parliamentarians. We take the occupation before you enter these jobs. And this lets us classify 95% of politicians and 85% of the 18 plus population. Yes.
Yeah, so it's only manual.
Let's have a mic.
So it's only manual workers. It's not workers in the service sector, for example.
Service jobs, I think, are included to some extent. The big kind of missing category here might be clerical work, and that is, I mean, could be considered as service work. Yes, so like for women, the biggest occupations here would be work in childcare or elderly care, and for men, we have construction and manufacturing being the largest ones. And we do various alternative definitions of the working class, including one that takes also that also counts as service and clerical work.
And a nurse?
A nurse, I'm not sure. I'm not
They
sure
usually
about
end up there.
any single occupation. Yes.
They usually end up there, but it depends.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you like any like single occupations is going to be hard for me to, yes. So what is the political career? It might arguably be operationalized as a sequence of steps, taking a person from the local level to national office and starting alongside the person's regular job as kind of a third shift. So people here are probably very familiar with this, but we can think of the party as a firm with a head office, parliament, and then 290 municipal kind of establishments. And people usually start their career at the local level, and then they advance upward in the local hierarchy, and then they can go to the head office. How do people advance? There are selection committees in parties that usually consist of former senior politicians, and they use often internal primaries where members vote about who they want where on the ballot. And these internal primaries are guiding, so they can use it as a guide to set the ballot. Important is, for the Swedish context, is that people very rarely switch careers between parties. And if you start your career in one municipality, that's kind of where you continue. Most people continue their career. You don't, like in other countries, switch parties or switch around in this system. So our main definition of the career is like this. You start in the population. You then become a member, perhaps. We don't have data on that. The next career step that we can look at is appearing on the electoral ballot, but not becoming elected to the municipal assembly. So these are level 4. Level 3 are the people who have advanced to becoming elected to the municipal council. Level 2 is to be the local party leader, which we can identify because these people are most often listed at the top rank of the ballot. Then from the local level, people advance to parliament. And we can verify in our data that about 70% of new parliamentarians come from these positions. So this is really, I would say that this is the main way that political careers work in Sweden. We have many sensitivity tests to compare social class advancement, also including the regional level, landsting. Those are politically less important and only about 1,000 compared to 13,000 politicians here. We can include the regional level. We can add positions here, like the mayor or committee chairs, more positions at the local level. And we can look at people who skip steps, like go directly to parliament, go directly here, blah, blah. Like no other operationalization changes what I'm going to show you about workers, like huge disadvantage in career advancement. A final comment on the way that careers work is that Swedish parties have strong seniority principles. If you stay in the party and work hard, you're expected to advance. Okay, so the more periods you stay, the larger the chances are that you are going to get a leadership position. And here we just show that pattern where the number of periods in elected local office increases the probability that people are a local party leader and the chance that people go to parliament. So why would working class people advance more slowly in this system? We think of reasons for this using a categorization from the so-called supply and demand model by Norris and Lewandowski. Individual politicians could have what we might think of as supply factors that limit career advancement. Voters or parties might disfavor workers compared to non-workers, and union ties might be important here for helping working class people. So I'm going to talk about each of these. What are the individual resources that might, that workers might have less of that could affect their careers negatively? First, it wouldn't be surprising if workers had less political ambition given this super strong white-collar dominance of political systems. Despite this fact, there's mixed empirical evidence where I think maybe the most credible evidence shows that there isn't large gaps in ambition between workers and non-workers. Workers could have less competence somehow. Tim Besley talks about soft or hard competence for political office, where soft competence would be kind of your motivations and personality traits, public service ambition, serving the public rather than yourself, being more honest and working hard. Okay? And he thinks of hard ambition as some ability like your intelligence or your smartness. The best politician here would be a smart and honest politician. We want people to be both. It would be bad to have a smart and dishonest politician. So we want both public service motivation, grit, working hard, and smartness, according to Tim Besley's framework. So we don't expect these soft competence measures to be different between workers and non-workers, and previewing the results, they are not. When it comes to ability, there is a greater payoff for tertiary education if you are more smart. Okay, if we believe that, then smarter people are going to sort into tertiary education. And we could see white-collar people having more smartness and maybe having an easier way of advancing for that reason. We know, of course, also that selection on competence into tertiary education is imperfect at best. So, yes, that we should keep that in mind for sure. Finally, workers might have less time to invest in this third shift of developing their political career if their work conditions are such that they, for example, work in the nighttime or they have to be in the factory all the time. This makes it hard to attend political meetings or to have the time to invest. Voters, they could, in theory, prefer non-workers. They could perceive that workers are not smart or that workers are left-wing. Yeah. This is by far the most researched question on working class political representation, because people have voting data for workers and non-workers, and people can conduct survey experiments. So there's a lot of papers showing that voters do not prefer non-workers to workers. And that's also kind of the result from Swedish preference votes that I'm going to show you. Parties, on the other hand, are discussed as substantially more important in the existing literature. And in this case, we think of parties' roles as imposing a class ceiling in terms of promotion discrimination, like conditional on your competence. The party would be less likely to promote a worker compared to a non-worker. That could happen because parties have beliefs about voters' preference that might not be true. They could have beliefs about voters' ideology or voters' competence. There could also be social dynamics within the party organization. We know that people very fast form negative opinions about social outgroups, and social class has from the beginning of this in-group, out-group literature been considered as an important category in this type of theory. If selectors, like the party people, hold negative beliefs, that could affect what they do when they put together the ballot. But I think importantly, it could also affect various things that happen during the election period. And these decisions might help non-workers build more qualifications. Working class people might not receive like tasks that build your qualifications. They might receive less money to develop their activities within the party or in elections. They might not be favored by the party when it comes to media or bureaucratic connections. So I'm happy to discuss more about how we think about like future ways of potentially testing some of these mechanisms. Labor unions would be a counteracting force to workers' underrepresentation by helping workers to advance. There's some previous work on this, saying that blue-collar labor unions can play an important role by offering courses and training to working-class politicians to strengthen their self-confidence to go into politics. In some countries, like in Sweden, unions also have strong organizational ties, like they have direct influence on the nominations of politicians, which is the case in the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. So the labor Swedish trade union, the Confederacy, LO, trains workers, yes, but it also has formal nomination power within the Social Democratic Party. And so they can kind of they can help union-tied people to advance. Okay, questions? So now I'm gonna start with the first question. You know, we have our definition of workers, we have the career pipeline, and the first question is where in the career pipeline the workers disappear. So we're comparing the share of workers in the Swedish population 18 plus, about 50%, and we have this 50-year period here. The share of workers drops to about 35% among nominated local politicians. Drops even more, about 30% of local elected politicians, down to about 20-25% among local party leaders, and about 15% of parliamentarians. So you can see here that there's a slightly larger gap from entering politics, but then we have really all these steps being equally important. So workers disappear on all career steps here, clearly. Looking relatively, so here we're just dividing this with this. Yeah. So workers' relative representation has maybe improved a little bit over time, but I'm going to compare that to other groups later, and you'll see how bad the situation is. There's no difference in the pattern of a gradual decline in representation on higher career steps between women and men. The pattern looks the same for different definitions of social class, measuring class at age 37 instead of the election year, using the most common occupation in your life history that we can observe, taking the lack of tertiary education to measure working class, or using below median income. Here we can see how badly workers are doing compared to other political minorities, women, young people below 35, and foreign-born. This is the share of workers in parliament. So now I'm looking only at parliamentarians, but this kind of looks the same at the local level.
Sorry,
Yes?
foreign-born, that's just completed, so you're born outside?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And do you have if you look at having one parent, like there's no second generation?
There's no underrepresentation at all for second-generation immigrants compared to second-generation immigrants in the population.
Very good.
Yeah, we have another paper on. Yes. So the underrepresentation of foreign-born really comes from the first generation. So workers here, you can see, their proportion is low. The proportion of parliamentarians has maybe increased a little bit over time, but the increases, this is underrepresentation. So workers are represented by 80%, right? Share of workers, 15% is 80%, is 20% of the population proportion of 50%. So in contrast, women's relative representation has gone from like 60% underrepresentation to near perfect representation now. And young people are also entering, and also foreign-born. But working class people are like stuck outside the political system. Which parties are failing to represent workers? So unlike gender, for example, or foreign-born, we might expect, young people, they should be in all parties. Here, that's not as clear at all, because we might want working class people and non-workers to be in different parties so that the party system can solve social class conflict between people. People vote for different parties, and those parties negotiate to kind of solve these distributional conflicts. So it's interesting to compare the political left and right, for sure. Using the European color scheme with red representing left parties, we have the Social Democrats and Left Party having the largest proportions of elected workers at the local level and also at the national level, more than the center-right parties, but eclipsed kind of by the Sweden Democrat parties, Sweden's populist radical right party, that entered parliament in 2010 and is now second largest party. They have the most workers out of any party at both levels. What happens within parties are workers, the drop-off in the career pipeline, is that a drop-off equally large within all parties? So we look at the drop-off relative to the population, so the same statistic, share of workers in the party compared to the population, up in the top row of graphs. So we put all election years on top of each other and compare the proportion of workers in the party to on each of these positions in the party to the population proportion. And you can see downward sloping trends in all parties. Workers are disappearing at higher levels.
I'm sorry, is the L, is that the left party?
Yes, no, L is the left party, yes, and Lib is the liberal party. Here we have the left-wing party, yes, Social Democrats, left-wing, and Green Party. But I think the way we should think about this is not that each party should necessarily have the same proportion of workers as share of workers in the population. They should have the same share as the proportion of workers in their own party's electorate. So down here, we calculate the proportion of workers among each party's voters using the Swedish election studies. Okay, so we do that for all the election years that we have, and we kind of take that and combine that with our other data. And you can see here what I think is very interesting, that the Social Democrats was actually doing better, certainly, than the center-right parties when we compared workers to the population. But if we kind of calibrate to the party's own share of working class voters, this party now does no better in representing workers on these career positions compared to the center-right. And the Sweden Democrat does the best still. The Social Democrats, kind of finishing up this descriptive first part of the results, I want to emphasize that the Social Democrats, it's both kind of the best thing about the Swedish system by bringing working class people into politics and taking them up to parliament, but this party is also the biggest stumbling block. So over here, we're just plotting the composition of existing parliamentarians from the different parties, with blue combining all the center-right parties together. You can see that over time, 2/3, declining now, but 2/3 have come from the Social Democratic Party. So that party is bringing most working class people into parliament out of the 15% that are there. But if we instead look at what we call missing workers, so what would the number of workers be if each party had the same proportion as the proportion of workers in their electorate? Okay. Using that kind of perfect representation as the benchmark, we can calculate which party is underrepresenting workers the most, which party is contributing most to the missing workers who would be there if representation was perfect. So here you can see again that the Social Democrats is contributing 2/3 of the missing workers, because this party is very large, it has a lot of parliamentarians, and it's underrepresenting workers to the same extent as the other parties relative to its electorate, and it has a lot of working class voters. So for policy here, if we wanted to increase the share of workers, which I think we definitely should in the political system, we should focus maybe on all career steps, like no career step is necessarily more important than the other, and the Social Democratic Party might be very important also more recently, the Sweden Democrats increasing share of workers, but also growing proportion of these missing workers here, maybe even larger now in 2022. Yes.
Is it based on the actual working class votes?
Yes, working. So in the Swedish election studies, there's questions on social class. So we can see what proportion of each party's voters are workers.
Okay, super. And this is then the missing working class.
The missing workers are calculated so that if the Social Democrats have 70% workers among their electorate, and doing that for each party, what would the number of workers in parliament be? Like how much larger would it be? And which parties would those extra workers come from?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what it is. Thank you. So maybe a comment here on a very famous Swedish report that came in the 80s called Maktutredningen. The government inquiry was arguing that Sweden was pretty maybe unique in the world, but at least Sweden had two powerful groups in society, like the white-collar people and the blue-collar people, and they had kind of equal decision-making power in the political system. And that was because of Sweden's strong unions kind of helping this dual like power balance to exist. What we see here in this descriptive part is that the working class people are not in politics. That does not seem to be the case, that there's power sharing. Like the labor parties are strongly underrepresenting the working class according to this definition that we're using here. So we might need to...
But that they didn't talk about representation in parliament. They thought about the unions being
Yes,
powerful.
but they talked about like decision-making power in society and how like political influence in Sweden was balanced by these two like large, powerful groups. And you're going to see how like unions are not able to help workers into. They have very kind of limited role in helping workers advance in the Social Democratic Party.
Meant that they meant power in another respect, not only the decision.
No, not only they looked at different types of power, right? But they also talked about political influence. Yes, I think. Thank you. Why are workers disappearing? I compare first these resources that I talked about: preference votes, individual resources, work conditions to think about time deficits, and then we estimate promotion gaps. And then I look at labor unions. So we put the results on preference votes and voter preferences first because it's so straightforward and quick to report. There is no indication in the preference votes that workers receive less preference votes than non-workers. So similar to any other research out there in the world, and there is many papers on this, like I said. We don't see an indication here that voters are expressing a negative preference for workers and with their preference votes. And we have another paper showing that parties use these preference votes to guide political promotion. So they are, important in the system. What about the soft competence and politicians' ambition? Here we are using survey data to try to compare workers and non-workers. So using a survey question to voters, I could see myself as a municipal politician for the party I like the most. 20% of Swedish people can see themselves as a local politician. And this figure is about 5 percentage points, so 20% lower among workers than non-workers. So to enter politics, there seems to be an ambition gap here. Once we look using the Kolfe data on the municipal politicians, and with the question of how long you want to stay in local politics, we no longer see a gap. If anything, workers are likely to say that they want to stay longer. And staying longer here is thought of as a measure of so-called progressive ambitions to advance in politics because of the seniority system that these parties have. So workers are not more likely to say that they want to get out of there. They want to stay. And in fact, they do stay. Yeah, they stay as much. They just don't advance. I'm going to show you that also. Okay, what about soft competence? Now we are on this part still in the Kolfu survey data of 2/3 of all local elected politicians, and we're comparing these 4 measures of soft competence, and I'm showing just the gap in standard deviations of these competence measurements. Very validated and long, like survey. It's like got many items. Survey instrument measures public service motivation. We have honesty, humility. This comes from a validated personality test that we administrated to the politicians. Hours worked and campaign work, these are self-reported. And we don't see any like large or gaps. Like there's really nothing here in terms of differences between workers and non-workers. Hard competence. In contrast, there are large and significant gaps to workers' disadvantage. The cognitive score from Sweden's armed force qualification tests on high school grades, and also a variable that we call the earnings score, which measures your private sector earnings conditional on various aspects of like your labor market position. I can discuss this more if you have questions in the Q&A. We used this earlier work as a measurement of politicians' competence. Like this strongly predicts your advancement in politics, but it's not strongly correlated with social class. So that's like kind of the key strength here. It's an income-based measure that is of your productivity in the private labor market, where we have reduced, or very strongly reduced the correlation with social class. So that's the idea of it. You can see that on comparing workers and non-workers on different positions in the population, nominated politicians, elected, and local leaders, there is large gaps, negative gaps to workers' disadvantage. So are these gaps explaining why workers are not advancing? No, no, and that's what we look at in a couple of slides. Finally, for the individual resources, I want to highlight this issue, which has to do with work conditions in working class jobs, and the fact that they might constrain workers' career investments in politics. Here we use Arbetsmiljöundersökningen. This is a national representative data set existing for many years. We calculate an index of inflexible occupations, and we link that to the politician data at the 4-digit occupation level. Working class people in the population are much less likely to have schedule flexibility. They're much more likely to work night shifts, and they do split shifts work, delade turer, and they also have much less opportunity to work from home. When we presented this work to the LO, the Swedish trade unions, and they talked about it to politicians, they are emphasizing this as an important career impediment for working class people. So I think this is definitely something that is important. A problem in the quantitative analysis is that there's such a large difference between workers and non-workers in these work conditions that when we combine this into an index, there's a 1.45 standard deviation difference between workers and non-workers. Yes, so there's very strong collinearity here between being working class and having inflexible work conditions. So that makes it very difficult for us to like control for it in a regression and get some kind of sense of the importance of these things with standard quantitative analysis. I'm going to report what we find, but I don't necessarily think we have the best analysis of this yet. So work conditions and maybe these smartness variables, maybe that's the reason why workers aren't advancing. So we look at that, and at the same time, of course, we try to evaluate what we call the class ceiling. If conditional on these competence variables, are workers still less likely to advance? If so, that could be a sign of some other things going on that creates this promotion discrimination. So now we have, we know the 4 steps, and we have 50 years of data. So we know, like Johanna Rickne was on this level, this election, and next year she kind of advanced to this level or she stayed the same. So we take all those like career promotion events, and the outcome is going to be promotion from one level to the next. And this is going to take the value 0 if the person stays on the same level or leaves politics. We have the dummy for being a worker. And then we have these, I'm going to include demographic traits. They don't matter, as you're going to see here. We control for seniority, the number of periods in office, because this is a qualification. And then we're going to add the armed force qualification tests, the high school grades, the things I just talked about. We always have combined fixed effects for the combination of election, municipality, and party. So if all of us are the Social Democratic Party in Stockholm Municipality, we're only comparing, we're comparing us, workers and non-workers within our party. Okay. So we're always comparing within the same party or local party organization. I'm rescaling this estimate. This would be the percentage point gap, right, between workers and non-workers in the probability to advance. But we divide this with the average of the outcome. So we're immediately seeing workers' relative probability to advance. This makes the results much more comparable between levels. Otherwise you'd have super small figures for parliament, very large figures. We'd have so by rescaling immediately when we report the results, we can create, I think it's easier to understand the difference between levels. Okay, so each regression compares one lower adjacent level to the higher. So for the first one, the sample is the population in election T. The outcome is 1 for people out of the population who enter the first nomination level, lowest career step. And then the next, this shows regressions where the sample is the nominated and the outcome is kind of advancing to being elected, and then elected to local party leader, municipal councillor to parliamentarian. And these capture, as I said, the percent difference. So workers are 50% less likely than non-workers to enter politics here in the bivariate regression with these socio-demographic controls. These are not doing really anything to the estimate, though. Okay, so what do we see? I mean, the overall message should be clear. There are large and negative estimates everywhere. The workers are much less likely to advance than non-workers on all career levels here, and I already showed you that in the descriptive analysis. But also, we can control for these ability measurements, your earning score, your high school grades, and your cognitive score. These have slightly different samples, right? IQ test is only for men. High school grades, you have to have graduated after 96 from high school, I think. So we kind of we go like, what about how large are the disadvantages in the sample where we have high school grades? What does it matter if we add high school grades? So that's kind of the sequence. But I don't think that's as important as just looking at this table and concluding that really no matter how we throw in these 3 variables, we can't really budge very much the promotion disadvantage. Yes?
Just super quick so I understand the result. Of the people who are local party leaders or municipal councillors,
yes.
Do you have a notion of to what extent that is their full-time job?
For local party leaders, the only full-time job is going to be the mayor.
Okay, but municipal councillors, only some of them has it at full-time job.
One person the mayor has a full-time job, and in the largest municipalities, maybe the vice mayor. That's usually a part-time position in the smaller ones, if it's paid at all. So for anyone who works full-time, like if you're the mayor in 2006, we don't use that occupation for you. We go back in time to look at what... Okay.
No, I was thinking about the effects of having less flexible work. If they're working as politicians, that effect goes away, right?
Yeah, that might be a good way of... we should think of that for the future. Like maybe you switch into the political job.
You can't claim that it's a list.
Yeah, thanks. So precisely to this question, when we add the time constraint variable here, it reduces these gap sizes that I just showed by about 1/4. But I wouldn't really, so it's important according to that analysis. But as I said, the strong correlation between the variables makes this difficult to kind of disentangle. And I think there's certainly room for more future research here. The audience might have lingering questions about workers' competence. Maybe there's some other competence here that we're not controlling for. So we do various things to try to think about that. Maybe you learn some skills in tertiary education. So tertiary education in and of itself kind of teaches you something like public speaking or reading legal documents or something like that. So we can look at workers' promotion disadvantage after we remove everyone with tertiary education from the sample. So now we're comparing everyone without a tertiary education. The gap remains very large. We can control for education level with dummy variables for each level. Within education levels, workers have substantially lower promotion chances than non-workers. We can think of skills learned on white-collar jobs using the ONET database for occupational traits. That database has an interesting online search function where you can find the tasks performed by a legislator in the United States. For example, the speaking, the fundraising in their case, writing legislation. Okay? And then you can find the other jobs in the labor market that have the strongest match with the task composition of the political job, like a lawyer also looks at. Yeah. So we use that similarity index, and we control for that, and that also doesn't take away workers' disadvantage here. Finally, maybe workers quit more often, and we count them as non-promoters if they quit. But in fact, there's no gap in renomination here. Workers don't leave these positions more often. They remain in there. They're just not promoted. Yeah. Finally then, to what extent are labor unions helping workers to advance? Here I think we managed to figure out kind of a new measurement of having a union tie. We used jobbregistret, which tells you small payments from any payment in a year of more than $10 from any employer. So we can find anyone who received payment of money from a blue-collar labor union in the year. And this is about 5% of the population. And we think, as far as we figured out, it captures like a lot of these people who are representatives of labor unions in their firm. Very few of these, like 98% are them. Very few are also like, there's about 2% or less that are employed by the labor union, of course, also included. So we take that measure and kind of look at, we call that a union-linked worker, and we look at their advancement. First, I'm just reporting the proportion of union-linked workers. So I said it's 5% of the population, but much more in the Social Democratic Party, in the Left Party, much, much lower in the other parties. And you can see the Sweden Democrats, of course, with an antagonistic relationship with blue-collar labor unions. There are very few, despite having so many working-class politicians, their links to the labor unions is very, non-important. So are working-class people with a union tie being helped by this tie? Like, are unions helping their linked workers to advance relative to the non-linked workers? What I'm showing here is just repeating the same analysis that I had before, promotion probabilities from one level to the next, but I'm splitting the worker dummy into two, workers with a union tie and workers without a union tie. So both of them are compared to the non-workers. And I mean, maybe for obvious reasons, we're splitting the sample here into the Social Democrats and Left Party and the other parties. And the results in the other parties is, it's very straightforward. There's like an equally large disadvantage for union-linked and non-union-linked workers. There's really no difference. Unions aren't doing much in terms of these helping linked workers. But in the Social Democrats and Left Party, we see a huge advantage of being a union-linked workers in entering. So union-linked worker is 400 times more likely than a white-collar person to enter the lowest career levels in these parties. Then at the next level, we see that union-linked people have the same probability of advancement as white-collar people. and they do better than non-union linked workers. But as I think I already mentioned, when we look at higher career steps, union linked and non-union linked workers do equally bad. So there's no like, unions seem to here be helping workers a lot in entering these parties, but then for higher levels, they're not doing, giving workers any advantage anymore. Concluding, in this paper, we addressed 2 key questions. Where in the pipeline to parliament do workers disappear and why? We found that workers become gradually fewer on each career step. Left ideological and radical right parties have more workers in the Swedish system. And if we would choose like a focus party for efforts to increase the proportion of workers, it would be the Social Democrats, because they contribute the most to workers' underrepresentation in politics, because so many workers vote for them and workers have such a large career promotion disadvantage within that party. More recently, of course, the Sweden Democrats having the most workers, but also like that's also an interesting party to study. And theories on radical right parties over time would suggest that the gradual like entry of these parties into the political mainstream might attract more so-called careerists into the party, and that could kind of change the social composition of these parties. So we will see what happens to the social class composition there as time goes on. Why do workers disappear? Voters doesn't seem important at all. Soft competence doesn't seem important. There's some evidence of like lower ambitions to enter politics, which could be one focus area for policy. But the largest like issue here seems to be, according to this analysis, that there are large promotion gaps remaining after holding quote-unquote hard competence and skills constant. So this is suggestive evidence that something is going on within these parties in the formal nomination structure, or perhaps even more importantly in like social organizational psychology group dynamics that's going on. In addition, of course, to time constraints from the occupation that I talked about that might also help. Non-workers invest more in their careers because they can attend these meetings and different times and so on, which working class people maybe cannot. Finally, Swedish labor unions seem to do a lot by helping workers reaching the lower career steps in these strongly union-linked parties, but really not beyond advancing to those initial steps. Okay, thank you very much.